Director General, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Are jobs after the pandemic going to be better?
You know, when the pandemic hit, I think we began to look at the changes that were taking place, the things we were forced to do by the pandemic in the ways that we worked. And we began to construct this idea that as we emerged from the crisis, we were going to move to some sort of new normal. And of course, this linked up to the idea of building back better. Now, in the situation we're actually in as we move into the third calendar year of living with COVID, I think the realities are beginning to seep through, albeit in a rather uncertain way. And the first thing that I can detect from our current circumstances is that this is a messy process. There is no grand design taking place in the world of work, which would enable us to say, in answer to your question, we are going to something better. We are going to a better normal. What we are actually facing is a very uneven, very uncertain and fragile recovery process, which I have to say is leading us in sometimes contradictory, sometimes encouraging, but also sometimes very worrying directions. Some people are doing actually quite well during the crisis and coming from it, but some people are also in deep trouble. We've seen, for example, a major increase in poverty, both working poverty and non-work poverty. And that doesn't really line up, does it, with the notion of a better future?
The numbers out of the ILO recently, in fact, look rather grim. Are there any silver linings?
Well, the numbers we've put out, I think we have to take two messages from them. One is that, yes, the global economy is moving forward. You know, the growth figures around 4%. Jobs are coming back, so there is positive news. It's not all doom and gloom, but the reality equally is that this recovery is slower than we were originally anticipating. A lot of this has to do, of course, with the way that the pandemic is evolving and the lingering effects right now of Omicron and whatever comes next. It is slower, it is fragile, and above all, and I think this is a point that might be emphasized, very unequal. What do I mean by the unequal nature of the recovery? Simply that those richer countries and more advanced economies are doing better in general than our developing and emerging economies. And there are two very simple explanations for why that is the case. The first, and I don't think you'll be surprised to hear this, Lynn, is that the unequal distribution of vaccinations favors some countries over others. You know, we've estimated that for every 14 people who get fully vaccinated, you can add one full-time job to your job market. So that's one aspect. And the other is simply to do with fiscal muscle. Those countries which have the resources, the wherewithal to stimulate their economy, to promote enterprises, to protect workers, well, self-evidently, they're bouncing back rather better. So the worry I have here is we might be witnessing what others have called a great divergence in the recovery process, almost a two-speed recovery, with the more affluent world doing better and the developing and emerging economies doing rather less well.
Traditionally, if you have very high unemployment, wages will go down because basically people are out of jobs, and when they're out of jobs, they're willing to take a lower wage. Are we going to see that?
In those places where we're seeing tightening labor markets, and let's point to the United States in this regard, where unemployment's around the 4% mark, there is evidence of some increase, a bidding up of wages, as is logical, I think, in a tightening labor market. The question is, again, is this a temporary phenomenon? Is it universal? Is it concentrated in certain sectors? And I think we also ought to acknowledge two other factors in these circumstances. One, of course, is the fact that wages have been stagnant or growing much more slowly than productivity and output in many countries for many decades. So there is an element of readjustment in all of this. That's the first thing. And the second thing, and it's pretty important to many people, is as we see a reappearance of inflation around the world, 5% in Europe, 7% in the United States. Clearly, some nominal wage increases is little more than a maintenance of real wages. So again, I don't think that we can be too sure about which way things are heading. But there is one thing which COVID, I think, has made a difference to, and that is our focus upon those at the bottom end of the labour market. Some of those who are on minimum wages or close to minimum wages in many countries, but who are performing services and functions which COVID has made us really understand are of vital importance to our societies. Perhaps we need to revalue these people's contribution to the global economy, to our national societies, and how we reward them.
Should we be paying all of these persons better?
Well, I mean, one is the case that the contribution these people make to our societies and our economies is under-rewarded. And I think that there is a case in that regard. But the other is, I would say, the much more hard-headed calculations that result from labour supply and labour demand in our economies. And, you know, there is evidence, although I think that the dialogue about the Great Resignation is somewhat overblown, but there is evidence of people leaving certain sectors, certain activities that they previously occupied before COVID hit, and wanting to go out to get something better, something which gives them better conditions and more pay. So yes, we see in the hospitality sector, we see in the retail sector, something of a migration of workers. Transport is another example. Now, we have to work out how we're going to respond to that, but clearly one answer, I think it is inevitable, has to do with an improvement of conditions and pay in that type of activity.
But it does mean also that we, on the consumer side, we have to be willing to pay more.
Well, yeah, be it the T-shirts that we tend to buy as cheaply as possible, those meals that we order at home, the care that we look for our families and our kids. Yes, it may well be, and I'm afraid this is a logical consequence of the conversation we're having. I think it's worth just pausing to reflect on them. The circumstances of migrant workers, again, in your region, quite a high population of international migrants, 48 million. You know, these are people who very often are at the lower end of the labour market. They do fulfil some of the functions that we're talking about, relatively low paid, but absolutely essential to the lives that we lead. And we've seen during COVID-19 that these people have suffered quite badly in many cases. They've often been at the forefront of infections because of the circumstances in which they live. Some of them have been repatriated in sometimes difficult conditions. I believe that when we think about a post-COVID situation, I think we will see migration resume. There is some debate about whether migration will be adversely affected by the experience of COVID. My expectation is that migration will continue to grow, to go on the upward trajectory it was previously on post-COVID. And that being the case, I think it is important that we reinforce our mechanisms for the governance of labour migration. It isn't a field, if I speak to you very frankly from a part of the international system, it's not a field in which international governance has worked particularly well. And I think we owe it to ourselves as well as to those migrant workers to do a little bit better in that regard.
Citibank has turned around and said that, well, for its US offices at least, if you are not vaccinated, unless you have a valid reason, a health reason not to be vaccinated and have an exemption, you're going to lose your job. You have to be vaccinated. What does the ILO think of that?
We think this is a very complicated debate. I have to say first up that our organisation institutionally has not taken a formal position on compulsory vaccinations, situations in which being vaccinated and having proof of vaccination needs to be a precondition either for entering the workplace or maintaining your employment with an employer, which are situations which are now arising, not only, I would stress, by decisions of individual companies, and you've made reference to some of those, but by national legislation. And we do see countries saying that either across the board or in respect of certain categories of worker, and I think again of health workers, some of these people have to be vaccinated, or you run the risk of losing your job, or at least of having your contract suspended. Now, we haven't taken a formal position around these issues, but I think there's a couple of issues which are very clear. The first is that the first the first effort needs to be towards encouragement of workers and indeed citizens in general to get vaccinated. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And we've seen major efforts made, not only by governments, but also by employers, some parts of the organized labor movement, to encourage workers to get vaccinated. Varying acceptance, I have to say, varying reactions to situations of mandatory vaccination. We do not have, not from governments, but not from labor or employers either, a uniform reaction to vaccine mandates. And we've seen, for example, a recent decision of the US Supreme Court in terms of vaccination mandates in the United States. But again, one of the general principles one can extract from this rather confusing and swirling situation, where I do think, and I agree with the point you made at the outset, that we are seeing a tightening of attitudes here, a hardening up of attitudes. Governments are getting much more mandatory on all of this. I mean, the basic responsibility of everybody in the world of work is to exercise a duty of care. So when you come back to a workplace, if you've been away from it, it is the responsibility of all parties to ensure that that workplace is a safe and a healthy place to be.
Can't we see this, though, as the same as it's even more than wearing you won't allow a person to go onto a work site without a hard hat.
Well, then you've gone to the crux of the matter and the heart of the dilemma. There are very considerable majorities of people in general and workforces in particular who are themselves vaccinated and would like everybody else that they come into contact with and work with also to be vaccinated. The dilemma, if you like, is how you treat that recalcitrant minority. Might be really quite small groups of people, but for one reason or another, and some of them adduce different reasons of principle or of medical considerations, the refuseniks who simply say, no, I am not prepared to do this. And this is, I think, it's almost a moral question, isn't it? It's almost an ethical question of the degree to which we can coerce people who don't want to undertake a certain pattern of behavior to conform to what society in general thinks is the right thing to do. And the difference between the hard hat example, it's a great example, the hard hat example, or even the mask example, and the vaccination situation, of course, is that those who are reluctant on vaccinations consider that there is a major invasion of one's physical integrity. I mean, they take it almost as a violation of their physical integrity involved in in this type of situation. I have to be very honest, these are not arguments I sympathize with. I'm strongly supportive certainly of people getting vaccinated. And I have to say, I understand those measures that have been taken, certainly to advantage those who are vaccinated, and to make it clear to the non-vaccinated that, well, there are certain things in life that they won't be able to do, be it socially or in other respects.
We've seen a terrible loss of jobs globally. But for temporary work, that wasn't the case. Why is it that temporary work seemed to be all right through the pandemic?
Well, I think we've seen actually countervailing trends here. In the first part of the COVID crisis, and this is typical of downturns in labour markets, serious downturns in labour markets, companies did offload temporary workers in significant numbers, simply because that was the easiest thing to do. If one of your colleagues' contract is coming up to expiry and you're looking to downsize the workforce, the easiest thing, of course, is to offload, as it were, the temporary workers. And that's what happened in the first part. And yet, as we've moved further into the COVID experience and labour markets have begun to move in the right directions and economic growth has taken off again, conversely now, temporary workers have been taken on in greater numbers. So as you've said, if you look at the figures overall, what you find is from beginning to end of the COVID crisis, stability in the numbers of temporary workers. It sounds somewhat counterintuitive, but it reflects or is the aggregation of these countervailing factors, the offloading at the beginning and the return now. What is interesting is our research shows that, in fact, the people who are now coming back into temporary jobs are not the same people, and they're not necessarily doing the same jobs. So this is significant churn in our labour markets. There are new temporary jobs having picked up the space of old temporary jobs, both in terms of function and the people doing them.
These are all these fantastic, computer scientists who can sit in Goa and code for their company in Zurich or New York or Singapore. And that the pandemic has actually accelerated that. Is the gig economy our saving grace, the one great thing that's come out of the pandemic?
Well, I think if you look at temporary workers generically, it's a very heterogeneous group of people. Some of them will be the gig workers that you're referring to. Others will be quite different situations. And I think when you look at the merits, the demerits, the advantages, the disadvantages of temporary work, from the worker's perspective, you'll find different things. Temporary work, by the way, if you look at it overall, tends to be paid less than those permanent workers on permanent contracts. So there are disadvantages there. But you pointed to a very specific phenomenon, which the ILO was studying in some depth prior to the pandemic. This is the gig economy, which is itself a very complex economy, but includes those people, not the people who deliver food on a bicycle or a motorbike, but who may be sitting at the end of a computer terminal in one continent and one part of the world and delivering services and jobs for people in another part of the world. And there, I think we have a massive set of issues to deal with. They pre-existed the COVID crisis. I suspect they have come further into focus because of the crisis. If a company in Singapore, for example, hires an independent expert, computer whiz kid, I don't know, in Panama, I don't know, I take that as a purely arbitrary example. Question is, who is responsible for regulating the pay, the conditions, the contractual obligations arising from that type of relationship? One argument is, well, this isn't really anything that has to do with that type of arrangement. It's a purely commercial relationship. It's not an employment or labor relationship. So you just offer the job, you offer a price for it, and that's where your responsibility ends. But this would be, I think, quite a serious development if it was taken to be the general trend, because it would represent the commercialization of a labor relationship, an employment relationship, which normally brings with it a certain degree of responsibility in terms of minimum pay, hours of work, safety and health, and other matters. So at a certain point, and you'll allow me to say that the International Labour Organization thinks it's got a role to play in this regard, we're going to have to look at this and try to standardize or to get some common principles accepted internationally to work out what type of views we take in regard to these issues.
Final question, Director General. I'm a stewardess. I've been working for an airline. It's been a very, very tough 2 years where I've been out of work a lot of the time. Should I stay and continue and persist and say, no, this is what I wanted as my career? Or would you say to this lady standing in front of you, it's time for you to change jobs. The world has changed way too much. We've looked at the numbers. Go get yourself some other job.
But as somebody who used to be on aeroplanes most days of my life and has been on 3 aeroplane trips in the last 2 years, I understand where your question is coming from. I think in the first place, we know that transport and transport-related activities are amongst those that have been hardest hit. And as is the case with tourism, I think are going to be some of those which will be slowest to reactivate as we go forward. But we are not looking forward, in my view, to a future where air travel will disappear or be vastly diminished over pre-existing levels. So my advice, if I'm in a position to give it to aviation personnel, is that what you've been through, and it's been massively painful, we all know the stories over the last couple of years, this isn't where we're going to be in a year or 2 years' time. So if you have the wherewithal to sit this one out, to get through the resilience, to get through the immediacy of the crisis, I don't think there's a reason to believe that you are in a profession, in a sector which has no future. Quite the reverse. It may be different, it may feel different, but it's going to be there and it's going to be important.
So you say take heart.
Take heart. That's a message for us all.
Director General, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
My pleasure.